one choice isn't right. Choice isn't right. Choice isn't right.
In the UK, I've had less interaction with the mental health system. I think by the time I came to the UK, I have started defining myself as a service avoider rather than a service user. I have very long history of using mental health services in India, and over the course of many years I've received about 5 different psychiatric diagnoses. So I have a long history with psychiatric services. Over the many years I've had about 5 different diagnoses. But the way I see it is that I've always had voices and visions since I was a child, and I have come to learn and look at them as another way of being human. So I call that experience as being in non-consensus reality, that I have this experience of slipping into a reality that other people may not share. But of course psychiatry has looked at it as psychosis and various other diagnoses, which I have not found very useful. Neither have I found medication and other kinds of psychiatry only related help any use. I think of madness as more of a socio-cultural phenomenon. When I came to this work, this was not my field. I'm trained in English literature and cultural studies. But because of my experience, and also I was part of the women's movement in India, and we had lots of discussions about women's distress and how that gets turned into idea of women's mental illness. So there were a lot of discussions within the movement, and that kind of turned me to look into what cultural representations of madness was like. So early on in my work I was looking at cinema and TV and how that represented ideas about madness in the way that then that is what people get to see. So what is being told as popular representations is quite important in the way general public gets an idea about what madness is. And my feeling is that that has a very key role to play in how people will interact with then people who are seen as mad, etc. Where I come from, there are other ways of understanding madness as well. Not always good, although there's in some ways there's certain tolerance of mad people as part of communities, but there is also insensitivity and intolerance of them as well. But it is not necessarily understood as a psychiatric condition. It can also be understood as spiritual, cultural, or just generally people, just another way of being. I'm not saying that's always seen as a good thing. People might still see somebody as just another way of being and yet not be kind to them. So in India at least we are an ex-colonial country, and we have a very extended psychiatric system, institutional psychiatry, etc. And this is of colonial British psychiatry, and even today that is how it is set up. So regardless of what other cultural representations exist, the main way of understanding it is in terms of a biomedical model. And people see that as, although it is on the one hand it's seen as illness, but there's still this fear of what is not normal, I think. And so if a film portrays somebody with mental illness either as a comedian or a joker or somebody to be laughed at, or as somebody who doesn't have control of their emotions and they're shown as violent and abusive, etc., those are the kind of things that people do then tend to associate with in real life, as it were. So a lot of that comes from this idea that there is something wrong with your mind. It is a mind that is unsound or mind that is irrational. And I think that as humans of any culture, we have a fear of what we see as irrational or unsound. That's on the one hand. There are also cultural beliefs in terms of hereditary madness. This is something that some people believe, that if there is a mad person in your family, then that is going to go through the generations, as it were, and there's still places where people might then decide that they don't want to marry someone with a diagnosed mental illness, because then that would be reflected back onto generations, etc. So there are all these different ideas, but fundamentally I would think that it is an idea of, depending on cultural specificities, every culture has an idea of what is normal and rational, and what is outside of it is seen as something to be feared or something to be ridiculed, I think. Biomedical psychiatry was pretty same. The difference was that in India we have mental health law, we have a mental health act which is pretty similar to what we have in the UK. But Indian culture works in a way that there are always, it's not enforced into its full force, as it were. So, you could be seen as having an episode on the street and immediately police is not going to be called. People do tend to, it's okay to be seen as, embodying madness on the street, as it were. When I was coming here, one of my biggest fears was of involuntary commitment, that the law here really, kind of works in a way. I mean, your neighbors will call police or something, So that was quite a factor that I was quite scared of. I think here biomedical psychiatry is much more stringent, much more, it has a more of a hold, I think, than in India. And much less cultural options. Even if they're not very much in the mainstream discourse. Whereas in India, we are able to navigate through various different ways of talking about madness, whereas here it seems to be pretty much biomedical. I still remember once going to my psychiatrist with my husband, who is British born, half English, half Pakistani person. And his first question to me, I think he's probably gone and done some cultural capability or cultural whatever awareness training. But so this doctor was, even before asking anything else, he was asking me whether I would like my husband to leave the room. And I was a bit confused about it, sort of wondering, why would you want my husband to leave the room? And then he said that because, Asian men are very bad to Asian women, so you might not want him to be in the room. And I was sort of quite struck by that, because this stereotype that Asian men have some special ability to be bad more than any other, ethnicity men was quite interesting to watch. Yeah, I have not been hospitalized in this country, so I can't say how that experience is from my perspective.
What led you to decide to focus on researching the experience of black ethnic minority people in the mental health system here?
So the move was first into looking at madness and not mental health. Okay, I was looking at madness as a cultural phenomenon, not necessarily, like mental health or mental illness, not in that register. But after coming here, I worked with an organization called Mental Health Media, which is not there anymore. And one of the initial projects I was involved in had something to do to look at the intersection between race, ethnicity and madness, or other mental health. And I quickly found out that black and minority ethnic communities in this country have a very, very difficult relationship with mental health services. Especially some groups are particularly experiencing very negative care. I just got interested, and I also worked with very quickly I worked with a project at the Sainsbury Centre for Mental Health, which is now Centre for Mental Health, I think, called Breaking the Circles of Fear, with people who had been involved in that project initially, Errol Francis, Joanna Bennett, etc. And I quite quickly learned the very difficult field that it was. But also through that work, pretty much most of my interactions within the survivor movement was with survivors from black and Asian backgrounds. I also had quite a bit of dealings with the white survivor movement, but I found that within the survivor movement itself there were issues of racism. And so all of this kind of came together, I think, to kind of look at not just, and also it's not just about experiences of mental health services, it is about as people who are experiencing these things but also actively resisting the negative parts of this. How does race and madness intersect? We have many decades of evidence about what happens when a black and minority ethnic person, I don't particularly like that terminology. I tend to use the terminology racialized groups. So people who are racialized as black or as other in this country, usually from ex-colonial countries, who have come here as migrants and then settled and became British citizens, they have a very different, the system seems to look at them very differently. So, first of all, there are many experiences that are misdiagnosed as various illnesses, especially schizophrenia. So I think there is a lot of cultural misconceptions, lot of emotional ways in which people are translated into being personality problems, and that leads to being diagnosed as mental health issues. But beyond that, even once you are in the system, there is, I won't quote numbers because this is quite well known, that, there are key issues in terms of involuntary commitment through the police, that is use of the Section 136 of the Mental Health Act, excessive use of force, over-medication, misdiagnosis of schizophrenia. All of this has been highly, and not just once or twice. This has been a kind of consistent finding of work that has gone on at least since the 1950s and 60s. And we've had various policy changes, most famously the Delivering Race Equality program, which was aiming to change this situation, but nothing seems to quite work. So in some ways, I have moved away from kind of saying that there are these problems, because as far as I'm concerned, these problems are well established, to kind of seeing how can we challenge it and what actions can be done. How are people, my interest is to see how are people and communities coming together to move forward regardless or despite of these problems that exist, because constantly talking about the problems, anything everyone wants to ask us is about, tell us what your problems are. I would point people to the reports that have come out of the Care Quality Commission, the CQC reports. There are annual surveys, annual reports of the use of Mental Health Act would be a great place. These are all online, so people can look it up themselves. There's been, in the 5 years of Delivering Race Equality program, there's been a report every year called Count Me In, and that is very specifically looking at details of Black and minority ethnic people's experiences within the mental health system. And if people are interested in kind of a broad background to and history and how that has continued, I would highly recommend the books by Dr. Suman Fernando. Especially his latest book is called Institutional Racism in Psychiatry and Clinical Psychology, which came out last year, I think. That would be a great place to start. So one clear thing that's been argued ever since the David Rocky Bennett case, I don't know if you're familiar with that. David Bennett was a African Caribbean young man who died in psychiatric custody, which in 1998, which then led to a very big inquiry. And that is the first time that the government admitted that the NHS was institutionally racist. And since then, there's been a lot of policies that has been trying to look at how to change this situation. In terms of why that is generally, is that if you look at the history of psychiatry, psychiatry itself was a discipline that originated in or to serve the purposes of colonialism. The whole idea was to think of a European psyche which was different from the psyches of the other, whether it is African psyche or Indian psyche or the Aboriginal psyche in Australia, etc., which sets up the European as the normal or the higher in the hierarchy of what it means to be human, and then seeing everybody else as less than that ideal. So in a way you can, and Dr. Suman Fernando has traced this history. In a way you can see that the establishment of psychiatric systems within colonial countries parallels colonial enterprises, parallels slavery, and it's, the way that trade goes forward. So the accumulation of resources and taking on lands in other parts of the world, psychiatry was one of the many disciplines that sort of helped do that purpose. And yes, I think it is. So I personally think that psychiatry is fundamentally racist. And then, it kind of, there are many different reasons why it continues. There is always the fear of the other, which, regardless of many decades, many centuries of interaction, doesn't seem to go away. So yes, there is a legacy of that whole history. UK has a very long history of the survivor movement and the disability rights movement. So my interest was also to look at what role people from racialized groups have played in these movements. And usually what you get is this idea that, black and minority ethnic people do not involve themselves in the survivor movement. We've tried, but we haven't found anybody. Or you get a chance of going and sitting on a panel as the only black person in the room around a big table of other white people. So I can give a couple of examples of how I have. So my interest is to kind of change the narrative in some ways. So one of the things that I have done is to look at this idea called user involvement, which has been part of our policy since the 1990s in one shape or the other, and to see where we sit as communities in these activities that are called user involvement. And a key finding from that, and I did several interviews with people and focus groups with people who've been activists, service users and survivors who've been activists for a very long time. Only to find out that for a lot of black people, going into survivor spaces, they go there initially because they are interested in challenging the status quo, they're interested in rights-based dialogue, they're interested in kind of critiquing what is going on, right? But once you're there, it is, the survivor spaces also reflect the kind of racist attitudes and stereotypes that are outside in the survivor movement. So for a lot of the people who go in there, it's not a very great place to interact with. I still remember, I will never forget, this quote from a particular survivor, black survivor, who said that, it was like I could be part of the movement if I only spoke about my madness. But look at my skin. I cannot speak only of madness. My madness is implicated with my skin. I can't hang this outside the door and come inside the room to speak of madness. And so, where there has been spaces where people have been allowed to bring this intersecting identity in, some work has happened, but most of the time there is no space for that. So I wanted to see what else they were doing. So the history that I'm doing now, it is specifically a history of activism and advocacy by users and survivors from African, Caribbean and Asian backgrounds. And the history goes back quite a bit in terms, and so when people say there's not been many BME groups, etc., it kind of changes the status quo, because people have been organizing in small groups, maybe not as well known as some of the mainstream groups, but there's been action. So my current work is to try and map that history. So I haven't finished all the interviews, but one of the key headlines from that is there is a clear trajectory of people through their experience in mental health services, and most often coercive experience within mental health services, when they come out or when they are in the hospitals themselves, is when they actively want to challenge. So they want to, that's the route to becoming activists or advocates in this work. And pretty much the trajectory is that usually they would then join a local group of users and survivors. But it seems like very quickly they realize that this group is not going to be able to help them address the kind of concerns that they want to talk about, because of what we said earlier about how intersecting ideas don't tend to work very well. And so then they go and set up a separate group. That is a space where you can speak and you can bring in issues that affect you, not just as a mad person, but also as who you are in other ways. So that seems to be quite a trend in pretty much all of the people I've spoken so far, in the sense that they've come through the mainstream movement, but then had to diversify and do their own thing, as it were. but it's not like it's not like totally separate either, because one of the things that I also started with the idea that the Black Survivor movement, if we can call it that, sits at the intersection between the user survivor movement and the critical psychiatry movement on the one hand, and on the other hand is the anti-racism movement, which is not necessarily only about mental health, the kind of larger anti-racism movement. So it's like collaborations with both these movements, but also contradicting or in conflict with. So it's like a little space that is between these two social movements, as it were.
Often such small groups which have a very strong common interest are almost can be a sort of seedbed for people then going back out into the movement and challenging for more intersectionality. Has that happened?
It has happened. So that's another very interesting thing, because usually when people do that, the answer given to us is saying that we need to be more diverse, we need to be more inclusive. Now, I myself, pretty much most of my work here, I have argued for diversity within spaces, whether it's movements, whether it is any kind of steering group panels or whatever it is. You always argued for that. But the problem with diversity is that it can get very tokenistic. That you can bring one black person into the room and say that, okay, now we have diversity. And in some ways, diversity tends to place the onus of changing things on the person who is excluded from the group rather than on the people who are in the group itself. So at some point you have to change that dynamic and to say that what we need to address really is whiteness, not diversity. So if your group is examining the kind of entrenched whiteness or in the culture of the group, or in the way without, most of the time it is probably also even unthinkingly, but if that happens, then you cannot just by bringing one or two people in to shift the thing. It's not going to change. So we've started, a lot more people are talking about the idea of kind of examining whiteness and the ways it works within movement space.
In a way, it's a bit like the parallel from the women's movement, that actually the problem with sexism is really something originating from men, and men themselves have to challenge this to make places habitable. And it's a bit similar to that.
It is similar to that, and the other parallel within the women's movement is also how the black women's movement started saying that you cannot only talk about gender, and that white feminist movement has to reckon with the idea of what it means to be women for people who are from racialized communities. So that intersectional bit needs to come in. So there's a lot more people now kind of arguing for that rather than just for a space at the table or or talking about diversity. Dialogues are happening, I think. To what extent it is, I don't know. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I've made a very clear decision to withdraw from any place where people come to you to say, can you come and speak at this conference, or can you sit on this panel? And if I find out that I'm the only person of color in that room, I now say no. When people ask me to come and speak in a conference about black people's experiences, I tell them that, can I come and speak about whiteness instead? And most often the answer is no. So, because I don't want to really go address a room full of white people and then start saying how terrible it is for us, our experiences, because as I said, you all know this, you don't need me to come and say this. But can we turn the tables and say that, why is it continuing to be terrible? How do spaces get consolidated in terms of whiteness? What is white privilege? How does that work out? Can I have a dialogue with a room full of white people about that? Challenging psychiatry as a whole is usually not the focus of most of the smaller local groups. I mean, yes, they do challenge practices of their local hospitals or local practices, etc. Because we've only once had in this country a national platform for black and minority ethnic user survivors, and that was from 2006 to 2011. It was called Catch a Fire. Catch a Fire was a network of BME user survivor people and their groups. again, it was only a network. It wasn't like a very umbrella body. It was a space to bring all these smaller groups together. So a lot of the work in the smaller groups is in terms of, first of all, providing a space for people to come together to actively engage with this idea of how race exists alongside, intersects with madness. The second is more in terms of peer support, not necessarily in the way it is defined in literature as having a specific, shared, well, there is shared experience, but it's not like institutionalized in terms of peer support. So people come together to do campaigns locally. So for example, there was a closure of a Asian drop-in in Lambeth, and which was successfully challenged by the local Black and minority ethnic user survivor group called Amardeep. So there's several examples of how that has happened in terms of campaigning for a very specific idea or issue. The other thing is to just support each other, because that's what happens in terms of just having a space where people can go and be has been a big part of the campaign. The other thing is to also develop ideas around what, collective ideas around what is recovery, or what is, what do people think recovery means to themselves, not necessarily in terms of what we are told recovery is. Or coming together to do community development work. So in terms of talking to the community and changing community's own perceptions. Art has become quite a strong, historically I think for the Black user groups, art has become a strong...
Are there any particular groups you could point to? I don't know, Tara Arts or anything like that?
So currently existing, the Sound Minds, which is started by Devon Marston, who's been around for such a long time. They use music mainly to do their work. A lot of the groups that have existed are not there anymore. That has to be said.
And
but there are
part of the austerity measures has cut back local authority grants.
This is well. Broadly, Black voluntary sector has always found it difficult to exist. So it's not just about mental health service users or even about mental health. The Black third sector has found it always difficult to exist. But there's been, and within that, to have really well-resourced user survivor groups is way more difficult than that. But we did have, like I said, when the national platform was there, the DRE program was, the Delivering Race Equality program was supporting it, and hence there was, so much more activity around the country. But ever since that's finished, it's almost like now we've dealt with race, now we don't need to think about race. So a lot of the organizations that worked then has gone. But policy shifts anyway affect. So to give you another example is that it has taken decades of activism for the Black voluntary sector to set up advocacy organizations. But when the Independent Mental Health Act advocate and the Independent Mental Capacity Advocates, IMHA and IMCA came in, government also did a change in policy saying that you now had to have block contracts to do this. What that then meant is that large advocacy organizations went and got all of the contracts at a local level, effectively killing up a lot of the advocacy organizations, which took us decades to build up to. So it's not only austerity, but austerity is definitely doubly affected.
But that as a factor has affected both the whole disability movement. It's
yes,
not just...
and within that, within the disability movement, as with anything else, intersectionally it has affected even further. Yes, definitely. I have found much less articulation of disability as a concept within the Black and Asian user survivor movement or the people I've interviewed so far, except maybe for one person. But that person has also been quite active in the disability arts movement. Maybe that's why. But disability, the concept of disability in the way that is used in the disability movement doesn't seem to be the same, at least when it comes to mental health. Physical disabilities and other sort of disability sector might be different.
But except that, I mean, that's true because of the way people are formed, but for instance, the recent report from the UN rapporteur on poverty, and also the report on the CRPD, which of course does cover the whole mental health range.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying for people specifically, people who identify as users and survivors, they don't tend to identify as person with disability.
Right.
That's person with psychosocial disability. That's what I mean by the register. You know, in their own self-identity is what I mean, not necessarily in the way other people.
And do you think that's because for them there's an extra stigma about disability, that somehow it's almost separate?
No, I think it is because of the huge amount of coercion people feel.
Right.
I don't think it is about the stigma of disability. There is this argument that's been made elsewhere that race in itself is disabling. And that is something that people have challenged quite ferociously, because to say that, you know, being who I am in itself is disabling is like, you know, so there is that. It hasn't sat very well, I don't think, in terms of, at least the way it has been articulated. In the US, I think it is different, because I think there's been a much more involved history of or participation of racialized groups in the development of what disability is in itself. Whereas here, I think there's been much less, at least from mental health user survivor movements part, much less involvement of us in defining these concepts. The main bit of coercion is to do with how the law is used on people. And for African and African Caribbean men, the use of Section 136 is, you know, like I said, it's quite well established in terms of how that is the main route that bring people from African and African Caribbean groups into mental health services. So anything that is seen as dangerous or fearful or, you know, all of those things just immediately gets translated as a mental health problem and brought in. So obviously the law is right up there. But it is also, you know, like, coercion can also work in other ways, in the sense that if you do not have any other avenue and then you're forced into going only down one route, it is another way of coercing people without actually literally coercing them, if you see what I mean. Having said all of these things, my work, the history work, is not really about examining these things. It is about literally mapping the history of our movement. So it is a narrative history, and I think that's probably something that we could talk about in terms of why history. Because first of all, as colonized and enslaved people, racialized groups have experienced historically the negation and the dismantling of their history. Sometimes, you know, people have names that are not theirs. There's a whole range of languages have gone, cultures have disappeared. So there is that. So history is part of who you are. History is part of how you find your place in the world. And this is something that has come up from the interviews quite strongly, is the actively involving in these community groups was a way of finding one's own place in the world, as it were. So it is, you know, beyond any other aims of changing psychiatric system or challenging practices, etc. This is clearly finding my own place in the world. It's been repeated by several people when I interview them. But there are existing histories of the user survivor movement, and there are other projects in place. But even there, you barely find the history of the Black survivor movement in that. Even if we're just mentioned in passing in just one line, saying that BME people also had a few groups set up. So for us, I mean, there's African American survivor Vanessa Jackson, who says that, you know, we can no longer wait for the user survivor movement to include us in their histories as an addendum. For me, that's been very, you know, kind of sort of inspiring to see that we have to tell our own histories, not wait for, you know, not just constantly say that, but your histories haven't included us. So it's about doing our own histories. The second thing I'm trying to do is to build an archive. So as I interview people and hear about the groups they have been working with, etc., in the history, I'm also trying to collect as much material as possible about that history. And the hope is that I would be able to place that archive in one of the public archives so that people can use it, students can use it, etc.
Are you going to do any online representation of
I
that?
don't have any funding for that so far. I will try.
But that would be
would
make
absolutely
it much
useful.
more accessible
Yeah, but
to people.
I am in conversation with a couple of archival places, and we can see. I mean, that'd be great if that happens, definitely. And there's a sort of agrarian women's group historically, I mean quite a while ago in South India, who wrote a book called We Were Making History, Stree Shakti Sangatana. And they say that, there's a quote in that book where it says that to be deprived of a past is to inherit an impoverished present and a future sealed off from change. For me, the project is in itself just one aim. Its aim is to write the history.